Right, so it's my honour to introduce our second plenary on open scholarship in applied linguistics, past, present and future. Welcome both to delegates here in the room and those joining online from around the world. Hello, good morning, good evening, whatever time it is. For this plenary talk we have three speakers. First is Emma Marsden. Emma is Professor in the Centre for Advanced Studies in Language Education within the Department of Education, University of York. Between 2018 and 2023, she was Director of the National Centre for Excellence for Language Pedagogy, NCELP, a £2.17 million Department for Education funded initiative devoted to improving language curriculum design, teaching practice, uptake and exam performance. Beyond NCELP, Emma has a unique record of creating initiatives geared towards opening up research to practitioners, educators, students and the wider public, including IRIS and OASIS. With collaborators from around the globe, she's also been involved in numerous projects researching second language grammar, acquisition and instruction. Simultaneously, Emma has somehow also managed to find time to serve as language learning editor and to provide unrivaled mentoring and inspiration to PhD students, for which I and 14 others are immensely grateful. Second is Cylcia Bolibaugh. Cylcia is a newly crowned senior lecturer in the Centre for Advanced Studies in Language Education within the Department of Education here at York. Cylcia's research spans a range of second language acquisition issues, from processes underpinning the conventional aspects of language use and to how and whether language and learner factors shape acquisition in instructed and naturalistic contexts. Cylcia is an IRIS project director and leads the Education Researchers for Open Science EROS group. She's also behind a variety of invaluable open research sessions and resources, including the digital tools for reproducible research brown bag sessions and materials, open data workshops and a departmental R Cafe. Through these sessions and her generosity and expertise, Cylcia is helping researchers at all career stages take steps towards more open and accessible research practice. Finally, Meng Liu completes the lineup for this plenary. Meng is Assistant Professor at the School of English and International Studies, Beijing Foreign Studies University, and Associate at Cambridge Digital Humanities, University of Cambridge, where she completed her PhD. Her substantive research interest lies in the psychology of language learning, including motivation, self-concept, multilingualism and interculturality. She's also passionate about research methodology, with a particular interest in quantitative and mixed methods research, research synthesis and meta-science. Meng co-founded and co-convenes Open Applied Linguistics, an ALA research network dedicated to the promotion of open scholarship in applied linguistics. Her work was recognized with an honorable mention for the 2022 Faculty of Education Doctoral Student Excellence Award at the University of Cambridge. Meng is published in numerous journals and is winner of the 2022 Christopher Brumfitt Essay Prize by Language Teaching. So, without further ado, let's welcome our three speakers.
Thank you very much to the local organising committee. It's a great pleasure to be here and we're really happy. We've had great fun actually preparing today's plenary panel. So I'm going to talk about open scholarship in the past. I am the ghost of Christmas past to talk about where we have been over the last few years, and Cylcia Bolibaugh is going to be talking about the present and Meng Liu will be talking about the future. So in my talk, I'll be talking about the what and why of open scholarship, and very quickly we'll move on to part two, which is talking about some open research initiatives that have emerged quite recently to address some research challenges that we have in our field. So first of all, what is open scholarship? You'll notice that we're using the term scholarship as opposed to open research or open science. Open scholarship tends to be broader and includes open educational resources. And open science we tend to be erring away from a little bit because of the perception that this might only be relevant to certain epistemologies or methodologies. Whereas in fact, open scholarship is relevant to all epistemologies and approaches and methods. The open has recently been defined by a UNESCO publication as meaning discoverable, accessible, reusable, and transparent. A very challenging set of attributes that can apply to the whole research process, right from initial conceptualization of the research through to dissemination and co-producing further research, etc. So this is a taxonomy of open scholarship. It's enormous, and we're not going to be able to talk about all this, you may be pleased to know. We're going to touch upon various different issues you can see here on the screen. I'm not expecting you to have digested this taxonomy. But why? Why would we be wanting to change all these different aspects of our research infrastructure, behaviour, thinking, culture, processes? There has been a bunch of rationales presented that is driving this open scholarship movement. One is epistemic responsibility, a sense of epistemic duty defined in 1985 as the idea that researchers must learn to communicate with the public, be willing to do so, and indeed consider it their duty to do so. Another set of rationales is economic and pragmatic, related to, dare I say the words, efficiency, and the sort of the efficiency that can be gained by working together collaboratively. A very powerful and increasingly meaningful set of rationales, I think, as the discourse around Global South becomes more prominent, is social equity and the social justice in the knowledge economy. There are a set of personal and professional incentives too. There's an increasing body of meta-scientific work which demonstrates that if we engage in open research practices, our work is more visible, more cited. And finally, a set of arguments that relate to the quality of our research and its scope. And it's this set of rationales that I'll focus on more now in the second part of my talk. So I've picked 6 challenges that face the quality and the scope of our research, and then I'm going to talk about how a small number, and mainly those that I've been involved in, how a few open research initiatives could help address these challenges. So the first challenge is the poor availability of our instruments, of our actual materials, questionnaires, tests, interview protocols, analysis protocols. For example, we found that just 4% of studies had their materials available, and this kind of finding has been repeated over and over. But without open materials, how can we scrutinise what we do, and how can we build agendas over time and over space? One consequence of this lack of open materials is the low amounts of replication research, and we estimated that there's about 1 in every 400 published studies is a self-labelled replication study. There's observed low quality of replication research, and this leads me on to the second challenge, which is a lack of independent replication research, i.e. people trying to reproduce other people's research who are not sharing co-authorship with the original authors. So let's have a look at what sharing authorship does to the findings. So on the left here, you can see no author overlap, and you'll see that roughly, there's a little bit more, findings are likely to be supportive of the earlier findings if there is author overlap, if 1 or more of the authors on the replication is also on the initial study. But look what happens when there is author overlap. You're much more likely to find findings that are supportive of the earlier study. There are lots of different explanations for this finding. It's not just the bias that is all immediately occurred to us all, probably. There's lots of different explanations, but actually none of them really bear up under close scrutiny as being particularly healthy explanations. Okay, challenge 3 is the poor availability of data. How can we check, how can we extend previous data sets, analyses and claims if we simply can't access each other's data? So we found that only 6% of the replication studies, and that was only about 2 of the replication studies, actually used the old data in a new analysis, combined the data sets together. And so meta-analysts, what do? Well, they have to eliminate studies from their meta-analyses, and also they have to email researchers and ask for their data sets. But few researchers reply for lots of reasons. They've left their computer in the loft from their old house, etc. Lots of different reasons. But about 1 in 5 of the researchers could reply to us with their data set intact. So missing data. So how can open scholarship address the lack of open materials and data? There are many actively open individuals and groups, and this has been going on for some time. Many of us here have worked with corpora, created or worked with open corpora, and many of these are openly and freely available. There are many tools that have been made available, much software, in many subdomains of applied linguistics. And one you can hear about later in the local organisers symposium, which is following this talk, presented by Natalie Finlayson about the multilingual profiler. Another initiative is some infrastructure that I was involved in initiating in 2011 with Alison Mackey. IRIS is a repository of materials, data, and analyses and code that in relation to all aspects of languages research. So it's relevant to the whole discipline of applied linguistics, and it includes materials and data that are from all different methodologies, including qualitative materials and data. It has field-specific ontologies, which means that it's highly searchable along the terms that we all are familiar with: methods, participants, contexts, and measures. There's over 6,500 materials on, and it's had about 8,500 downloads, with a healthy number of data sets available now. Recently, we've added fields that allow people to hold information about the reliability, the instrument and inter-rater reliability of the instruments held on IRIS. Also, thanks to some of Cylcia's work, we now are able to give full references with a DOI to anything that is held on IRIS. And I say this now in one word: it's taken us about a year, nearly 2 years. As Cylcia said on the way here, we've had grey hairs arrive in the time that it took. This stuff is not, there is work behind this infrastructure that is going on here. So why it's really important to be able to give a full reference in DOI is because it means it's then citable. It means that full recognition is given to the materials and to the data that is so crucial for our research. We can put it on CVs and we can cite it. And now IRIS hosts postprints, absolutely critical for the knowledge economy. If we want to open up our research to those in the global south or others, then we need to make sure that the accepted version of articles and chapters is freely available. 37 journals support IRIS and mention it to their authors in the letters of acceptance. However, when we checked what rate of materials are actually held on IRIS back in 2017-18, we found that only about 14% of studies actually have their materials held on IRIS. That will have increased a little bit, and some people are now putting their materials on the OSF and other repositories, but I would bet it hasn't increased that much. So there's a long way to go. Challenge 4, the cheery title of Misconduct and Questionable Research Practices. In 2022, Dan Isbell and colleagues produced an article just published in the Modern Language Journal about a survey that was conducted among applied linguists. About 350 of us replied to the survey, and 1 in 6 of us admitted to misconduct, which includes inventing data. 94% of us, including me, admitted to reporting engaging in one or more grey areas of questionable research practices, including biases in decision-making, selective data cleaning, and selective data reporting. That moment where you go, I don't know how to explain that finding, I think I just won't report that bit. This clearly affects the validity, reliability, and reproducibility of our research. How can open scholarship help? One way is by pre-registration, and the aim of this pre-registration is to reduce our conscious and very often unconscious biases and temptations to undertake questionable research practices. So before data are collected, we publicly register, we say openly what we plan to do. This includes design methods, data cleaning, data cleaning and data coding and analyses. This is akin to Ulysses tying himself to a mast. He can clearly hear the sound of the sirens tempting him, but he is not able to go to them. Is pre-registration enough? Pre-registration can't help other challenges we face. One is publication bias, and the other is getting feedback when it's too late. Thank you, reviewers, for pointing out that my design is flawed. Now I've just submitted the manuscript. One way of approaching this is another article type, which has recently started to be used in applied linguistics, called registered reports. In this article type, your plans are reviewed before you collect your data, and you can receive in-principle acceptance before you collect your data. And then the plans are checked once you've submitted your analysed data and your report, then your plans are checked. I'll be talking more about registered reports in the local symposium after this talk. Challenge 5, the scope of our research. I think most of us here would agree, particularly following Alison's brilliant plenary this morning, that we need to broaden the scope of our research to improve the equality, diversity and inclusion of our participants and contexts and the producers of our research. There has been a considerable amount of meta-research into our sampling practices. Our populations are usually weird. They are Western, educated, industrialised, rich and democratic, appreciating that westernised is a subjective construct, and as are many of those terms, but it's a handy acronym that gets us thinking. They are usually university students with a certain set of demographic characteristics, and the languages investigated are usually English or Western European or Mandarin, with some increasingly Mandarin and Arabic. So, as De Keyser et al. Said in 2010, almost every one of our samples has been one of convenience, and this has been, said again and again by other people. And yet we all know that literacy levels, socioeconomic status, geographical, political background, age, language background, influence, all these things influence how we perceive language, how we interact, how we use language, and how we learn languages. So how can open scholarship help broaden the range of our participants and producers and the context of our research? Well, by using open methods, tools and platforms, we enable more people to be able to participate in research. For example, one software is called Open Sesame, and others will be discussed in the local organisers symposium on open research after this talk. Also, this allows us to engage in open multi-site, sometimes replication, research to diversify the contexts. The final challenge is improving the scope of consumers and the co-producers of research. We are experiencing many top-down policies to encourage us to produce our research in open access venues. Europe's Plan S, and indeed there's a number of platinum open access journals in applied linguistics that you can see here. However, at the same time, new journals have recently emerged that are behind paywalls, and about 86% of these journals' work was behind paywalls up until 2021. This leads to poor access to research findings, obviously on a global level, but also on a local level. We found that only 60% of teachers and 30% of teacher educators had ever read, or had never read, an academic article. Again, there are lots of reasons that we know why teachers and teacher educators are not reading academic articles. One of those reasons is just pure lack of physical access to the articles. How can open scholarship help improve access? I'm going to talk very, very briefly about one example of making research findings systematically and sustainably more accessible, both physically and conceptually, and that is the project called OASIS, which is a repository of about now 1,500 one-page, non-technical summaries of published research. Each page has a section on what this research was about and why it is important, and the methods, and the results, and then a short section at the end on things to consider. OASIS was established 5 years ago. It's celebrating its 5th birthday round about now. And so far, 17 journals are collaborating with us, which makes it a sustainable initiative. There's over 1,500 summaries, and each summary, on average, has received 32 downloads. Importantly, the summaries are now increasingly in different languages, not just in English, and not just colonial languages too. There's a wider range of languages. And we've had about 30% of the downloads are from language teachers, and about 20% are from teacher educators. So we think that OASIS is broadening the breadth of consumers and potential co-producers of research. And you can hear more later from David in the local organisers' symposium on open research. So there I finish my whistle-stop tour of the past. So I hope I have described some of the rationales, well, what open scholarship can cover, some of the rationales, and some of the initiatives. We are clearly far from any state where open scholarship is established in applied linguistics, and we have a long journey ahead of us. I'm now going to hand over to Cylcia to talk about the present.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks also to the organizing committee for inviting us, and to all the volunteers here today at the back. So, my job. Where are we now in relation to open scholarship in applied linguistics? And as Emma just described, we know we have problems. We're not confident in a lot of our findings. We know we're often not reaching people outside academia, and too often research is carried out by, with, and for a relatively small group of privileged people. So that's the bad or the sobering news. But there is good news, which is that over the last 10 years, a huge number of people have tried to address some of these problems. And now we have a wide range of tools, initiatives, and new practices. I think what's most impressive about this is that out of nearly all the initiatives that Emma told you about, they were started by individuals or small groups of people who saw a problem and decided to address it. And so I like to think of the last 10 years in some ways as the let 1,000 flowers bloom era. And the metaphor makes me happy. Some of my best friends are gardeners. But I also know from being involved in some of these initiatives that they take a huge amount of time and energy. So how do we manage the potential downside risk of fragmentation, duplication, wasted effort? Is there some way that we can make all of these existing efforts more than the sum of their parts? So I'm going to think about this question a little bit in relation to a couple of the initiatives that I've been involved in the last couple of years, mainly to do with building infrastructures and communities that support open scholarship in applied linguistics. So in many ways, we are still living in a world that's defined by the limits of the printed journal article. Space was at a premium, and as you heard from Emma, not having access to our underlying data, our underlying materials, developed into a serious threat to the credibility of our research. But we've got a brave new world. It's all digital and online now. So there is a wealth of options for people to share their resources. Journals have online supplementary materials. Academics have personal institutional websites. We've got all sorts of repositories hosted by funders, institutions, different kinds of organizations. But unfortunately, new resources bring new problems. And the first one is just that it's hard to find stuff. And this is actually a really serious problem. So we have a wealth of resources, but very few of these are actually indexed, and particularly things that are on personal websites and even things that are in journal supplementary materials. What this means is if you don't know that it's there, you can't find it. And what makes it even worse is that many of these resources don't have any kind of what's called a persistent identifier, something like a DOI. And that means they're essentially at risk of just disappearing into the digital ether. And this is something that happens all the time. We've seen supplemental materials from journals just disappear when they change platforms. I think we've had a recent estimate that up to 50% of the data sets supporting published findings in psychology are at risk of disappearing. The other problem concerns not how much we're sharing, but how well. And I think we're increasingly beginning to recognize that we share things because we want them to be useful to other people, but it's actually really challenging to format them in a way so that they are. So, are we addressing these new challenges? Well, I mean, as you heard from Emma, there is some good news, right? We do have discipline-specific digital infrastructures that have things, persistent identifiers, DOIs. So we've got, for example, the Tromsø repository for linguistics, we've got TalkBank, and we have IRIS. And as you heard from Emma, IRIS is a repository that hosts data elicitation materials, actual data sets, and code, and postprints from all kinds of published research on language-related topics. But the key thing about IRIS is that it was designed to address this findability or this discovery problem. And so this rich field-specific metadata means that users can search by all of these things. So you could search by type of instrument, by research area, linguistic feature, data type, participant type, more. And all of these are really in contrast to some of the more generalist repositories like Figshare or OSF or Zenodo. So my first comment is support the curators and the maintainers. Our second challenge, though, I think is proving a bit more of a difficult nut to crack. So is what we're sharing fit for purpose? I think we're realizing that naming, formatting, annotating materials, doing that well is really difficult, and there's very little support out there for researchers to do it well. We recently evaluated all of the data sets that have been held on IRIS since 2017, both in terms of their completeness. So is everything related to the findings published in a journal on there? And we found that actually, for the most part, yes, so that's good. But unfortunately, when we looked at the reusability of those materials, so had authors done things like include separate README files, had they labeled all of their variables in a way that they were understandable to somebody else, we concluded that applied linguistics researchers are humans that are much like other humans in other disciplines. And sadly, that means that a majority of the data sets had shortcomings that limited their reusability in important ways, which I think is quite sad. So I think what this means is we've made some important strides in developing the infrastructures we need to support open scholarship in applied linguistics. But we need to encourage people to use these established disciplinary repositories as their first port of call. So whether that's Databrary for qualitative video data, whether it's TalkBank for child language data, whether it's IRIS. We also need to encourage people not just to share more, but to share better. And if we want to accomplish our end goals, which as Emma said, are scrutinizing, building our agendas, checking and extending our claims, we have to somehow move past this approach where we are now of just get it out there. But how are we going to do that? Well, as Emma said, we already have the problem that people's adoption of open practices tends to lag behind a kind of general commitment to openness. We all agree, openness is great, right? But openness in practice can be hard. So one solution to broadening participation is open scholarship communities. And these are bottom-up learning groups that help to make open scholarship knowledge more accessible. And they can exist on all kinds of different levels within and across disciplines. So as a few examples, institutionally, here at York, we've got education researchers for open science. On a disciplinary level, we now have the Open Applied Linguistics Network. And on a transdisciplinary level, we've got the Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Teaching. So AROS has been going for about 5 years now, and we've focused on training and mentoring, and it's really been a lot of fun, I have to say. We've really kind of created an open scholarship community. We've helped to build an institutional open research culture. It's been great. And one of the most pleasing outcomes, I would say, is that we've been able to support early career researchers to gain recognition, visibility, and funding for applying open practices to their work. If we turn to the Open Applied Linguistics Network, they just launched a year ago, 2022. But already they have introduced open scholarship practices to thousands of people. They've had successful launch events. They're running book clubs and all kinds of other events. So really impressive. The Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Teaching is a slightly differently angled initiative, and they're really focused on helping people to introduce open practices in their teaching. But again, it's a really impressive initiative. They've got all kinds of projects. They've got like an e-platform for people to find resources, many initiatives, some of which you can see here. So I think all of these brief examples highlight that collectively we can accomplish a lot. But there are limits to what grassroots volunteer efforts can do. I mean, to put it bluntly, we can't rely on more unpaid labor, right? We live in a context where we've got precarious working conditions, short-term contracts. People can't participate under those conditions. So how can we enable everybody to take part? Well, one of the things we need to think about, I think, is community governance, because early career researchers move on. People who convene a group don't agree to do that in perpetuity. They might want to do something else with their lives. So we need to think about the sustainability of communities. And we need to think about how we're going to support them. So where are communities situated? If it's an institution, they need institutional recognition. If it's a disciplinary organization, they need recognition from their professional society. And these groups need to support them not just with recognition, but actually with material and financial support. So I would say if you see an event by your local open scholarship community, go along. If you're a senior scholar, think about how you could support your local group. So if I just quickly turn back to where I started, of where we are now, I would say that we have a better idea of where some of the problems actually lie as we have begun to evaluate some of our efforts. But as we keep doing that, we need to come back to the principles of why we're actually doing things and not get hung up reifying particular practices. I think we're also reaching a crunch point as certain initiatives are maturing where we need to ask questions about how we support them in the longer term. So how do we organize ourselves? And finally, I think that even though we've got all these disparate initiatives, we've realized that if we want to move towards a more open, equitable, sustainable research system, we're going to have to think more broadly and more systematically. And so, as the first step down that road, I'm going to hand you over to Meng. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emma and Cylcia, for the riveting journey back in time. And thanks again to the organizers for having us. I'm extremely honored to be here to contribute my voice as an early career researcher. So now that we have retraced the evolution of open scholarship in applied linguistics, let's turn our gaze towards the horizon and look to the future. We stand at a critical juncture marked by a milestone event, which is the adoption of the UNESCO recommendation on open science. In 2021, at the UNESCO General Conference, nearly 200 member states adopted the first international standard-setting instrument on open science in the form of a UNESCO recommendation. Now, this event has effectively ushered in a new era for open science. The UNESCO recommendation on open science sets itself apart in multiple important ways. First, it is unparalleled global impact, which further consolidates the status of open science as the new norm of research. Second is its multi-stakeholder consultation process, which involved nearly 3,000 participants from over 100 countries. A distinguishing characteristic of the UNESCO recommendation is its inclusive vision of open science, which formally recognizes open science as relevant to all disciplines, which includes the social sciences and the humanities. As a result, we have one of the most comprehensive frameworks on open science, which covers key pillars, values, and principles. Specifically, the UNESCO recommendation outlines 4 key pillars, 4 core values, which are then operationalized into a set of principles. Now, this framework is particularly useful for our purposes today because they can serve as a blueprint for which to map our previous and existing efforts onto it and see the distribution of our efforts and thereby identify new directions for future development. So next, I'm going to take the key pillars as the map and pin the initiatives that Emma and Cylcia have mentioned onto it. So the first key pillar, which is open scientific knowledge. It has 5 branches, most of which must have been already familiar to you by now. Things like open data, open educational resources. The last one, open hardware, might be somewhat unfamiliar, which refers to the practice of sharing the design specifications of physical objects, such as research instruments. Now, on the next slide, I'm going to pin the examples of the initiatives onto the branches that they correspond with. So we can already see this is a really crowded page. I would really love to get into each of the initiatives, but unfortunately time doesn't allow me to do that. So instead, I've placed a link to each of them at the end of my slides so that you can check them out later. So clearly we can see concentrated efforts in the first 4 branches of this pillar. Now, with regards to the last one, open hardware, just as an inspiration for what might this branch entail, I'm giving you some examples. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to introduce the first one, which is called webgazer.js, which is a JavaScript package to reconfigure the webcams on our laptops into eye trackers. So this essentially lowers the cost and entry barriers to conducting basic eye tracking research. The second pillar, which is open science infrastructures. It has 2 branches, virtual and physical. So virtual infrastructures refers to things like OA journals, open repositories, and archives. Physical infrastructure refers to things like accessible research facilities, science parks, science museums, incubators. These are some of the examples from our field that align with this pillar. So on the left-hand side, you see the virtual infrastructure examples that were already covered by Emma. And on the right-hand side, we see some examples of physical infrastructures, specifically language museums. For example, the MITES project by Cambridge University organized the first pop-up language museum in the UK. And in China, we have 2 language museums, one by Beijing Foreign Studies University, one by Shanghai International Studies University. The third pillar open engagement of societal actors. Now, this is essentially about opening up our research collaboration, not just within our community, but beyond the traditional academic community. So it involves new forms of collaboration, such as crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, scientific volunteering, and citizen and participatory science. Compared with the previous two pillars, we have fewer examples, but still we did manage to find some interesting examples from our field. For example, in terms of crowdsourcing, we have a few crowdsourced research database. The PLATS library, which is focused on psychology of language learning and teaching, the Open Applied Linguistics Research Library on open scholarship research, and we have the LESLA Research Library, which is focused on literacy, education, and second language learning for adults. For citizen and participatory science, we have a really interesting project called Linkscape, which is a citizen science project of linguistic landscaping. Now, stepping outside our field, we have some more examples. For example, the Crowdfight, which is an initiative for enhancing interdisciplinary collaboration. We also have FORT, which was already covered by Cylcia, and it has engaged in both crowdsourcing and crowdfunding. Now, the fourth pillar, which is open dialogue with other knowledge systems. So this pillar has received the least amount of attention, not just in our field, but across disciplines. So essentially, this is about epistemic diversity and inclusion. So it emphasizes the importance of recognizing different epistemologies and the promotion of the representation of marginalized scholars, such as those from the Global South. Now, so it's really, the topics such as decolonization definitely fits this category. So it's really exciting and encouraging to see our opening plenary today by Professor Alison Phipps on this topic. Again, as inspirations for future directions, I'm giving you some example outside our field. So the first one is OCSD, which is Open and Collaborative Science in Development Network. So this network is dedicated to contributing voices from the Global South in terms of the potential of open science as a transformative tool for development. ABREER, which is Advancing Big Team Reproducible Science Through Increased Representation, is dedicated to diagnosing the unique barriers to open science faced by researchers in low to middle income countries or the Global South. When it comes to involving indigenous peoples, it is worth highlighting the CARE principles as a complement to the FAIR principles of data governance, which was covered by Cylcia. So the CARE principles emphasizes the importance of respecting the knowledge sovereignty of indigenous peoples and their right to benefit from that knowledge. So, using the key pillars as a map, we can see the distribution of our efforts so far. So the majority of our efforts have been concentrated on the first two pillars. Now, continued investments in these areas are clearly needed because there are still many unresolved issues in these areas, as covered by Emma and Cylcia already. But the rest of the pillars, they indicate additional directions that we might go in the future. Now, just because of our distribution of efforts have not been even, the values and principles have not been emphasized equally. So for example, the initiatives mentioned earlier, like open science badges, registered reports, or incentivizing replication research, they focus mostly on the first set of value and principles, things like quality and integrity, transparency, scrutiny, critique, and reproducibility. Just as what we saw with the key pillars, the rest of the values and principles can be taken as additional directions to go in the future. Now, for the sake of time, I'll just highlight two of the principles. One of them is the principle of flexibility. This is about the contextual embeddedness and responsiveness of open science. So essentially, it is recognizing that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. So different research paradigms may very well have different priorities and needs, and open science practices would necessarily look different. The other principle is sustainability. Open science is a long-term commitment as opposed to a transitory endeavor. Now, in order to make it truly sustainable, we have to monitor and reflect on our efforts to make sure that these are long-term balanced developments and there is equal participation. Now, with these values and principles in mind, let's move to the concluding section of our talk today, which is our call to action. Now, this is the joint work by Emma, Cylcia, and myself. So what can individual researchers do? Well, we really like the metaphor of open science as a buffet, which was proposed by Christina Bergman. And so we would actually propose the buffet approach to open science as our recommendations for what individual researchers can do. Just as when you go to a buffet, whatever you eat must fit your diet. When it comes to open science, you have to pick and choose the components and practices from open science that fit your specific project, career stage, personal skills, and institutional support. Now, as Brian Nosek has argued multiple times elsewhere, incrementalism is key. So we strongly recommend beginners to open science to start small and take gradual steps. Joining an OS community can be beneficial as well because the journey of open science can at times feel intimidating and challenging. So the support from a community of practice can be really beneficial. So we would welcome everyone to join Open Applied Linguistics for support and collaboration. Now, we would also like to make a special appeal to the senior influencers to take the lead because you're really in powerful positions to drive systemic change. We actually see a crucial role for professional bodies to play. In fact, we already see a lot of synergies between open science and our professional bodies. For example, BAAL's EDI statement, which was mentioned by Professor Zhu Hua this morning, ILA's endorsement of the Open Applied Linguistics Network statement. And we believe one of the most visible roles for professional bodies to play is to provide infrastructure support. And we would urge professional bodies to start strategizing plans for operationalizing the pledges, commitments, and endorsements that they have made. Potential responsibilities include hosting repositories, open access publications, and creating an enabling environment for open science. Of course, we appreciate that these won't be easy steps as they require substantial investments, but collectively we could share the responsibility and figure out solutions. So things like crowdsourcing and crowdfunding mentioned earlier could be potential solutions to make these endeavors more sustainable. So in our talk today, we have delved into open scholarship in applied linguistics. We have revisited the past, we have evaluated the present, and glimpsed into the future. But of course, no one can really predict the future, but collectively, we have the power to shape its trajectory. We hope our talk today is of some inspiration to you, and we would invite everyone to join us to create a future that resonates with us all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma, Cylcia, and Meng. We have time for questions. We've got helpers who have microphones, so if you just wait for the microphone here, online as well, pop your question in the chat if you have one. I think the first one is down here. There's a microphone that side, yes, coming.
Thank you everyone for that wonderful talk and overview, and I think taking us through the timeline like that was a really good move. I don't want to exacerbate the qualitative quantitative research divide, but obviously, the whole thing with replication and transparency obviously lends itself better to quantitative research. So I'm just wondering if you could give us some reflections, maybe past, present, and future, on how qualitative research fits into this.
It's a good question, one we did hope would come up. So I'll start as past and then pass it on. So many people ask this, and I try to emphasize in my talk that open science, open scholarship has something in it for everyone, regardless of epistemology and methodology. But as has been said later, of course, for example, qualitative researchers may actually not want to anonymise their data because the context is really important. The people who did the research, the people who asked the questions, and just the act of anonymising scripts and scenes and whatever it is that you want to analyse does harm to the data. But a maxim that is quite useful to bear in mind there is to open scholarship aims to be as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. So if you can't anonymize the data fully and it has to be kept under some kind of wall, then these repositories are available now that you have to apply to use it, but if you're a bona fide researcher, then the data is there for other people and it's curated and looked after. Even registered reports have qualitative dimensions. I'll be talking about that in a moment. So if you have exploratory analyses, serendipitous findings, they can all be accommodated in registered reports. So yeah, the discourse did come from quantitative and hypothesis testing, confirmatory approaches, but I think there's certainly something in it for almost everyone, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No. So I think what's interesting is I think what qualitative approaches can bring to this whole discourse is it really emphasizes this idea that we need to maintain some kind of epistemological humility, right? So as Emma said, this has been in many ways driven by ideas of verifiability and reproducibility. And these concepts might not even be meaningful in different strands of research. So I think we really need to take that with a grain of salt. But there are now there's a whole special issue on qualitative approaches in social psychology that makes a lot of really interesting points about how open scholarship could be redefined within qualitative approaches and what it could mean. So I'm not a qualitative researcher and I don't feel empowered to convey that, but I'd say we just need to make space for those voices at the table.
Yeah. Can I just say I echo what the two have already said. But I just feel like this is an exciting space because I see a lot of potential for qualitative research to make a contribution to open science. That's why the UNESCO framework has been so fascinating to me, because it has this inclusive vision. And it sort of keeps the framework on a general level, on the abstract level, but like in the implementation level, like how do we actually practice open science? That's sort of like open exploration for all of us. So I think it's important for people to join the conversation to start thinking about the values. For example, reproducibility may not be a priority for qualitative research. It doesn't make sense as a value, right? But what about other values like transparency? Like in what cases is that valuable? So I think these are sort of open questions that we need to start thinking about and then figuring out like what are the specific ways that we can actually make it work for qualitative research. So I'm going to refer back to the buffet approach again. So we have to, like fit our diet, whatever we take, we need to. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Another question, yes?
I have a quite quick but practical question. So earlier there was a discussion about pre-registering studies. Some of the websites and organizations I've seen that do that seem to veer towards certain disciplines. So a lot of the studies on there are all in political science, for example. Is there one website or organization that pre-registers studies you think is particularly good for applied linguistics, or does it not particularly matter so much?
I would say that maybe rather than discipline, it's about approach, right? So are you carrying out a primary empirical study? Is it a secondary data study? Is it observational? And there are people that is it qualitative? There are templates for all of these approaches that give people a starting point, and I think there is a repository of different templates on OSF. So I often direct people there. But as far as I know, we don't have one applied linguistics one. And I would even find it maybe difficult to imagine what it would look like given the diversity of approaches within the applied linguistics umbrella.
Hi, Ibrahim at Queen's University Belfast. Often when new initiatives are conceived, they are conceived with very noble values underpinning them. And then at some point in the future, that initiative becomes part of an institutional tool to judge and measure academic productivity, and then academics get judged on their connection to that initiative. Is that factored into your future, and how does that affect the possibility of maintaining the values of the vision?
Good question. I've seen Oppenheim. Okay, so yes, innovation can be used and misused, and then in the future we don't know how it's going to be used. And there is debate in the open scholarship community, indeed someone proposed that there should be league tables of open science, and that did not go down well. There's a debate online where that person was proposing this idea and it didn't go down well. So I mean, we have to be aware that we don't do that. And actually what I meant to say at the end of mine is we still do need a lot of meta research. We need people to be first of all checking that we need it. I presented some of the findings suggesting that we need it, checking that what we do, the interventions, the open science interventions are effective, and most importantly that they're not harmful. And some of the open access publication initiatives are known to be harmful because they're perpetuating the fact that some people can't afford to publish open access. So there are already examples of where the targets and the aims and the vision is getting corrupted and misused. So I just think that we all need to continue to be vigilant and make sure that we're doing the meta research that's checking our own research.
Yeah, and I think it's a responsibility for those of us who are proponents of openness to be particularly wary about this kind of institutional capture. I mean, I know that one of the things that we did here at York was kind of kibosh a reproducibility code of practice that would have implied that everybody had to do the same thing. So I think there is this tension between what do we think is good practice and then mandates at the top. And there's all kinds of issues. There's meta-research to see, is it harmful? Is it a good idea? Then there's, the Matthew effects. Are we inadvertently making things more unequal by promoting practices that only some people have the possibility of carrying out? So I think we have to look holistically at all these different levels of capacity and access before we start to get anywhere where we're telling people to do things as a mandate.
Yeah, I would say this question is above my pay grade, but I totally agree with what Emma and Cylcia have just said. I think that's why we emphasize there is no one-size-fits-all approach to open science. So that's why awareness raising is so important, because we don't want people to have the misconception of thinking this is a homogeneous entity, so that everybody should do the same and it should look the same to everybody. So I think that's at least a helpful first step to sort of raise the awareness to the level that people recognize the complexity of that and the contextual embeddedness of open science. And then we can figure out the rest, which are even more challenging.
I know our speakers are keen to continue the conversation outside the formal plenary. We're right on time, so let's thank them once again. Thank you.